What's going on, everyone? I'm just a typical, average American, here today to react and continue learning about what if Britain had won the American Revolution. Part 2. If you haven't seen Part 1, feel free to go check that out first, or stay here in Part 2. That's perfectly fine as well. But in Part 1, we started learning about what history may have been like in an alternate timeline if America had remained part of Great Britain. And not surprisingly, there would have been massive changes, major ramifications if we had remained part of Great Britain. It's very interesting to think about, actually. So I'm really excited to continue this video and see what other major changes could have happened in this scenario. So let's take a look.
The path to abolishing slavery in our timeline was bumpy, with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln kneecapping efforts to enforce racial equality and a compromise over a possibly stolen election a decade later, leading to the end of most Reconstruction efforts. This would lead to a century of racial oppression and segregation in the South. But in this timeline, the British would be responsible for overseeing the aftermath, and they would likely keep tighter control of the southern colonies.
Oh, see, this is really interesting. This is a topic that we're touching on, how slavery in the United States may have been drastically affected in this alternate timeline if we had been part of Great Britain, how slavery would have been different and handled differently, actually. So this is interesting.
The aid of the northern colonies in the war effort would mean the colonies as a whole wouldn't be punished, but the rebellious territories would likely see a heavier British presence for a long time. And any local officials who aided in the rebellion would likely see themselves forced out of power permanently. But
So they're saying that the American, Civil War would have probably happened still, with the North versus the South, and the South fighting, basically, to keep slavery. And in this timeline, Great Britain would have just sent in a bunch of reinforcements to basically easily and immediately quell the dissent in the South. And slavery probably would have been abolished sooner in this timeline. If Britain had won the American Revolution, slavery would have probably not even really been a thing for as long in America as we know it. That's interesting to think about. And then they're saying that British troops would have probably had to, occupy the southern United States for a while just to make sure everything remained peaceful, I guess.
a lot of this would have to do with a new figure. The elderly William IV would be dead by 1837, and he would be replaced by not another king, but by his niece Victoria. In the latest complex succession, Victoria took office at only 18 years old, and her reign was one of the most consequential in British history.
18 years old? Queen Victoria started when she was 18? Oh my god. This is another enormous factor that in the United States, we don't really think about British royalty or British rulers and how they might have affected us. But in this timeline, it really, really matters because America is part of Great Britain in this scenario. It really matters who the queen or king is. That would really have affected us here as well in America.
She was known as a strong supporter of British expansionism and would reign for 63 years, the longest term of service in the history of the British crown until the modern day. So the fate of the colonies would to a large extent be determined by the whims of this woman. Well, sort of. Britain has been a constitutional monarchy since 1688, and additional restrictions on the monarch's power were put into place since. This meant that Parliament has much of an impact on the laws of the time as Queen Victoria, and some monarchs were much more powerful than others.
This is good that they're mentioning this because this is something that confuses a lot of us Americans, like how much power the British monarchy actually has. Like in the modern day, there's been a lot of limitations set on the British monarch's power and how much they can actually influence law and government. And it's not very much anymore. But before a certain year, like hundreds of years ago, the British monarchs did have a lot more power and influence. So they're absolutely right, and this is something that Americans don't really understand because again, in in reality, history that actually happened, like America is separate from Great Britain. We don't really think about British monarchs. We don't know our British history and our British rulers as well as we should, honestly. But in this timeline, that would be completely flipped around.
Victoria would inherit a British Empire at its peak, as well as an unsettled status quo in the North American colonies. But the leadership of these colonies in helping to put down the rebellion of the southern states would be in good standing with the British government, and the region would be seen as the crown jewel of the territories.
Oh.
And that means one major question would be brewing.
Right.
We all know how the United States gained independence in our timeline, but what about Canada? It was a much
Wait. Are they? Did they just say that the United States would be the crown jewel territory of Great Britain? That's like a compliment, but at the same time, it's like it's like Great Britain kind of rules over us in this scenario. So it's like it's a compliment, but we're still like underneath Great Britain in a way. I don't know if that's the best way to think about it, but I'm going to choose to take this as a compliment. America would be one of Great Britain's proudest territories. Like, and now we're thinking about in this alternate timeline how this would affect Canada, which was a British territory as well, right?
much more sedate affair, with the British territories holding conferences to ask for independence and negotiating an exit from the United Kingdom. There was no revolution, and in many ways the British were ready to let it go. They wanted the country to defend itself, to take the financial burden off of them, and many English-Canadian nationalists wanted to unify the territories and consolidate their control over French-speaking Quebec.
Oh, this is really interesting. So they're saying, like, historically speaking, Canada was part of the United Kingdom, and then basically Canada asked very nicely, in a very Canadian way, can we be separate? Can we be independent? And Great Britain was basically like, yeah, sure, that's fine. Go ahead. That very well could have been the exact same scenario that happened to the United States in this alternate timeline. Eventually, in a roundabout way, the United States may have become independent in a peaceful way, just like Canada did. Rather than through a war and a revolution. That's very interesting. History might have just sort of ended up kind of where it's at now, but obviously there'd be major differences during that time period where America remained part of Great Britain, though.
But with no significant tension with the parent country, there was no desire for a hard break. So when Canada became independent, they chose to remain a Commonwealth country and maintained the Queen as their head of state while becoming autonomous in all government affairs.
This is exactly what would have happened, I think. This is exactly what would have happened. America would have just been another British territory that, like, became independent but remained part of the Commonwealth or what have you. That's probably exactly what would have happened.
Would the same have happened to the United Territories in this alternate timeline?
I think so.
It is possible, but there are a few things in the way. For one, the United States is much more fertile territory and had many more resources than Canada. Almost doubling the territory gives Britain almost an entire continent to control, but it also means higher cost to administer the territory. The odds are that Victoria and Parliament would be open to these negotiations for independence, but they might drive a harder bargain, wanting preferable trade deals long-term with the new country to ensure access to its resources.
This is interesting. So the narrator here is arguing that Great Britain would not so easily grant the United States our independence. It wouldn't be so easy because the United States would be valuable as a part of Great Britain. Apparently, we have a lot of like resources and stuff that are, I don't know, helpful and profitable to Great Britain, and what we'd negotiate some kind of deal, conditions, and rules under which America could maybe be independent, but not completely.
Whatever the terms of the deal, odds are they would be preferable to what had been imposed on them by the British Crown as a colony. And so this new country is born into a whole different world. In an instant, the United States of North America was born and became the largest country in the world by sheer space.
Wow. In this scenario, Canada and the United States have combined into one super country that's like taking up so much of North America. Wow, okay.
Containing all the territory of Canada and much of the modern-day United States.
Wow.
It would have the benefits of decades of buildup from the British Empire, as well as the scars of a recent rebellion. But in this time of growth, it's not the only country in North America to benefit. With the American Revolution never happening, Spain likely had the Southwest mostly to itself. Without the boost of the American Revolution to the hopes of the colonized countries worldwide, would Mexico have successfully won its own war in 1821? The Magic 8 Ball says, outlook cloudy. So it's possible.
I have to be honest, I don't know much of anything about Mexican history. It's interesting, and it makes sense that altering the timeline like this would cause a lot of collateral effects to all sorts of other countries, definitely to Canada and Mexico, since they're literally bordering the United States.
Possible that the Southwest North America would still be dominated by the Spanish crown, holding not just Mexico, but most of what's the American Southwest today. So is another war brewing? Probably not. While the territories of North America did eventually gain independence, they're all far from abandoned by Great Britain. Instead, they're likely considered extended family, and if someone punches your cousin, odds are you're jumping into the fray.
So this is like talking about potential conflict between the United States and Mexico? But in this scenario, the United States has a very, very close relationship with Great Britain. So, man, that'd be so interesting. Imagine how powerful that would be if the United States and the UK were basically combined, or working together like siblings or something. That'd be an enormous power. And I don't think anyone would want to mess with either of us if in that scenario, since we'd be like way, way, way bigger and stronger and wealthier and everything.
So Spain would be very cautious about trying to take any territory from this new country and vice versa. While it's possible the two empires could go to war again, maybe provoked by similar events to the Spanish-American War, that would be a much larger conflict and not likely to erupt immediately. So it's possible that Texas and California might never be united with the rest of the territory.
What? No! Oh no! We have to give up Texas and California in this timeline. What?
But the new country is also very much not in need of extra territory. But this would change a lot of things going forward, including for many of the area's most oppressed people. What would happen to the Native Americans in this new status quo? It wouldn't be all sunshine and roses, since the British, like all colonial powers, were responsible for mass displacement and murder. But certain key atrocities might have been averted. There was never a President Andrew Jackson in this timeline, so there was never a trail of tears. Much of the United States' worst atrocities toward natives happened in the Rush West, which would have happened in a much more orderly method in this timeline.
Man, it just sounds like in this alternate timeline, a lot of things would have happened much more peacefully, in a way. Like, we're talking about slavery going away quicker, the American Civil War ending a lot sooner, the conflict between Great Britain and the American colonies ending, and even the travesties that we caused to the Native Americans living in America originally. Even a lot of those travesties may not have happened how they happened here. Wow, would history have just been better? Like, dare I say, interesting to think about. I don't know.
However, the U.S. and Canada shared certain atrocities, such as the residential schools where Native children were taken from their parents and forcibly educated to behave more like white people. Those would still exist here under the British and the new government, but there's hope for a better future. Today, Canada's programs of reparations and autonomy for Natives go further than the U.S., and that might carry over in the Union. But what about the victims of slavery? Well, for one thing, slavery ends 30 years earlier. That's generations of people who aren't born into bondage.
Yeah.
The worst of segregation never happens as well, but for the millions of people who become free when slavery ends, things would likely turn out very differently. The British
Yeah.
control huge swaths of territory in Africa and the Caribbean, and the odds are they might offer some former slaves, especially those taken near the end of the slave trade, the choice to stay in the territory or return to their homeland.
Right. That's interesting. That's not at all how it happened. But it could have happened like this if Great Britain was part of the United States and Great Britain has colonies in Africa, they're saying?
Territory in Africa and the Caribbean. And
Africa and the Caribbean there's some British territories there, which could have facilitated some sort of like movement where if slaves who had been forcibly taken to the United States wanted an opportunity to go back to their homeland, that could have been facilitated in this alternate history. Wow.
the choice to stay in the territory or return to their homeland. It's impossible to know how many would take the offer, but
Yeah.
odds are most would not want to be displaced if they had built a life here. So today's country might be an equally diverse place, but one without the century of racial tension that culminated in the growing pains of the civil rights movement.
Oh my God, wow. Because, yeah, segregation and slavery and civil rights has been it was a massive issue and movement in the United States that took way too long for black people in the United States to gain certain rights and freedoms. I never realized, just through altering history like this, America losing our revolution, that possibly that could have all been avoided or shortened or something. I never realized, but if you think about it, it seems like it could be true.
And in some ways, history bends toward the same end. The territory did eventually gain independence, but with much less bloodshed. And most of European history proceeded apace, including eventually the World Wars. The growing tension between Germany and the rest of Europe would still have happened, but with one big difference: the closer ties between the nation taking up most of North America and its former colonial power. In our timeline, Britain was largely left alone to fight the German-aligned forces sweeping across Europe for the
Right.
first part of both wars, and it took major provocations to get the United States involved.
Right. That we've kind of touched on this already. In this new history, this alternate timeline, like anytime someone messes with Great Britain, the United States and Canada are there to back them up, and vice versa. Great Britain would back up the United States and Canada like instantly. Basically be like almost the same nation. So fighting for each other without even like a second thought. It'd just be a given, which could have decreased the likelihood of certain conflicts from happening with the threat of this huge combined Great Britain, America, Canada. Like that would have probably like dissuaded a lot of other conflicts, I would think.
A dirty German-Mexican deal the first time, and Pearl Harbor the second. But this time, as a Commonwealth nation, we likely would have been eager to get involved and help Great Britain. Canada entered both wars long before the United States, and the added forces might have helped win World War I, and potentially ended Hitler's reign several years before the Allies were able to in
Wow.
our timeline.
Wow. What? Really? This is... Should we have just lost the American Revolution? We're at the point where if America had lost the revolution and stayed part of Great Britain, Hitler would have been defeated quicker. That's what we're at here.
Which then raises the question, would it have been better if the United States didn't win its independence by revolution?
Yeah.
It's unlikely that Britain would have kept the colonies forever. And even
Yeah.
far-flung colonies like Australia gained their independence peacefully eventually. Part of this was the natural decline of the British Empire, but many countries were able to negotiate for an exit and the benefits of Commonwealth status without conflict.
That's so interesting. As an American, I have never thought about the history of other British Commonwealth countries. Like, lots of other countries were part of Great Britain and negotiated their independence over time, like very successfully and peacefully. America is like a unique case where we decided to gain independence through violence and bloodshed. And I never even thought about how there's a lot of examples of countries that did it all peacefully. That's really interesting.
Some countries weren't so lucky in the modern era, including Kenya, which fought a difficult battle for independence in the 20th century. But a country largely seen as an extension of Britain would have had an easier go. So what would the country look like now? Well, for
Yeah.
one thing, it would be the largest country in the world. Combining Canada and the United States makes it larger than Russia.
Wow.
And while there's no guarantee that it would have all the territories in the Southwest by now, it's likely to have expanded somewhat. Both the United States and Great Britain are strong economies, so this new country would have had the same strong infrastructure to build off. Of course, not everything would be sunshine and roses. All of the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States still have problems with the treatment of non-white residents in their countries, and any colonial power will be dealing with its past sins for a long time. But it would
Sure,
likely stand
sure.
alone as the world's greatest power. The United States is arguably the world's only superpower
Aha!
today, but the
Wow, this is a very optimistic view. It's basically almost saying that if the United States, if we had lost our fight for independence from Britain, we possibly, I never thought of it like this, but we possibly could have ended up in a slightly better position, like, or more powerful position than we are today. Wow.
odds are good that Great Britain would have had much more power and influence than it does in our timeline. An early victory in World War II, thanks to North America entering earlier, would have given Britain a stronger hand in negotiations post-war, and it would have kept many of its colonial holdings, while the anti-colonial movement would have continued and they likely would have given many of them independence. It might have been a smoother process.
And apparently, Great Britain could have ended up in a better situation than it is now. This could have just been, it could have just been better for America and Great Britain if America had just lost the revolution. I'd love for this to be shown to like a bunch of Americans in American history class and see what other Americans have to say about this. This is not at all what I expected.
After all, their biggest colony wound up gaining independence peacefully. The only thing we know for sure, if the American Revolution didn't happen, there likely would have been a lot more tea and tears in North America when the Queen passed away.
Yes.
Want to know about some other historical...
Yes, that's for sure. Like, things may have ended up this sort of similar as they are now, but there would have been all this British influence and culture in the United States. Like, we probably, like, seriously, we would probably have a British accent and have tea and all this good British stuff, but that was really fun to learn about. This was by the Infographics Show, and I gotta give that a like, because I liked that very much. That was just a really, really fun sort of thought exercise about this very interesting scenario that really could have happened, like, honestly. Like, that's the interesting part to me, is this isn't all just, like, complete fantasy. It really could have happened like this. Like, America could have lost our revolution and not gained our independence that way. And it's interesting to think about all the different pathways that could have resulted because of that. Very, very interesting. I enjoyed this quite a bit. Anyway, if you enjoyed this as well, feel free to give this video a like or leave a comment with your thoughts on what the US might be like if we had lost the revolution to Great Britain. And if you're interested in more videos like this, me reacting to Britain and British culture, feel free to subscribe for more. And until then, thanks for watching and see you next time.